I talked about this topic before, but it remains a major issue. If Britain and the EU fail to postpone post-Brexit trade rules dictating local content in electric vehicles traded between the European Union and the UK, average EU-made car prices will rise £3,400 in January, as a trade group said on Wednesday. The Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, the SMMT, said those same rules will also add £3,600 to the average British-built EV sold in Europe. Not only would consumers be out of pocket, but the industrial competitiveness of the UK and continental industries would be undermined, said SMMT CEO Marc in a statement. Under the rules of origin agreed in the EU-UK post-Brexit deal, the TCA, EVs need to have 45% EU or UK content from 2024, with a 50 to 60% requirement for the battery cells and packs, or face British or European Union import tariffs of 10%. But European and British supply chains for EVs are not yet advanced enough for electric cars produced to meet those rules, so automakers face a 10% tariff. World number 3 automaker Stellantis has said British car plants will close, with the loss of thousands of jobs unless the Brexit deal is swiftly renegotiated, while Ford has said it will slow the transition to electric. Automakers and industry groups like the SMMT have called for a 3-year delay to implementing the rules of origin. The European Automobile Manufacturers Association, the ACEA, has said the rules could cost car makers up to €4.3 billion in tariffs and hit output. So far, the EU executive has been reluctant to renegotiate the deal, and I come to this later again. In June, Stefan Führing, a European Commission official overseeing the post-Brexit EU-UK trade agreement, said the EU rules of origin were fit for purpose and that the European Union was not considering changing them. The EU executive is reluctant to renegotiate the Brexit deal with the UK on tariffs for electric vehicles for quite a number of reasons. There are concerns about setting a precedent. The EU is wary of setting a precedent by reopening the Brexit deal, as it could encourage other countries to demand similar concessions. This could weaken the EU's negotiating position in future trade deals. And of course, there is protecting EU interests. The EU wants to protect its own electric vehicle industry, which is still in its early stages of development. Lowering tariffs could make it harder for EU manufacturers to compete with cheaper imports from the UK or elsewhere. And of course, they want to maintain the integrity of the Brexit deal. The EU is committed to upholding the terms of the Brexit deal, which was painstakingly negotiated over several years. Renegotiating the deal could undermine the EU's credibility and make it harder to reach agreements with other countries. And of course, there's the focus on other priorities. The EU is currently focused on other pressing issues, such as the war in Ukraine, the energy crisis, and the still ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And renegotiating the Brexit deal would require significant time and resources, which the EU may not be willing to divert at this time. And the current rules are deemed sufficient, because the EU believes that the current rules of origin for electric vehicles are fit for purpose and encourage the development of EV supply chains within the EU and the UK. While the EU is reluctant to renegotiate the Brexit deal specifically on tariffs for electric vehicles, it still remains open to discussion with the UK on trade issues and is willing to consider making changes to the deal if there is a strong case for doing so. But this is not the one. The Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, between the EU and the UK outlines specific rules of origin for electric vehicles to qualify for zero tariffs when traded between the two regions. These rules are designed to ensure that the vehicles are substantially manufactured in either the EU or the UK, promoting local production and supply chains. And according to the TCA, an electric vehicle must meet certain criteria to qualify for preferential tariff treatment. And I got a little bit into it. But first, the vehicle must be assembled in either the EU or the UK, and the value of non-originating materials used in the vehicle must not exceed 40% of the ex-works price of the vehicle. And this means that at least 60% of the vehicle's value must come from materials sourced within the EU or the UK. For electric vehicles, the battery pack is considered a critical component, and to qualify for zero tariffs, the battery pack must either be produced entirely in the EU or the UK, or if the battery pack is not entirely produced in the EU or the UK, the value of non-originating materials used in the battery pack must not exceed 30% of the ex-works price of battery packs. And these rules of origin are designed to encourage the development of electric vehicle manufacturing and supply chains within the EU and the UK, as I said earlier. By requiring a significant proportion or portion of the vehicle's value to originate from within these regions, the TCA aims to promote local production and reduce reliance on imported components. However, these rules have been criticized for being too restrictive, particularly for the battery pack requirement. As the battery is a significant component of an electric vehicles, meeting the 30% non-originating materials threshold can be challenging, given that battery production is still largely concentrated in Asia. This could potentially hinder the growth of the electric vehicle industry in both the EU and the UK, because they didn't do their homework. The transition period for tariffs on electric vehicles under the Brexit deal between the UK and the EU was initially set to last for 3 years, starting from January 1st in 2021 and ending on December 31st in 2023. During this transition period, electric vehicles traded between the UK and the EU were not subject to tariffs regardless of their origin, as long as they met certain basic requirements. The introduction of tariffs on electric vehicles between the EU and the UK is a result of the UK's departure from the European Union, what we all know as Brexit. And prior to Brexit, the UK was part of the EU single market, which allowed for the free movement of goods, including cars, without any tariffs or quotas. However, with the UK's exit from the EU, new trade rules had to be established, including those governing the import and export of electric vehicles. The main reasons for imposing tariffs on electric vehicles between the UK and the EU are, for example, protecting the domestic industries. Both the EU and the UK have ambitions to develop their own electric vehicle industries, and tariffs can act as a way to protect these industries from foreign competition. By imposing tariffs on imported electric vehicles, governments can make it more expensive for consumers to buy foreign-made EVs, potentially giving domestic manufacturers an advantage. Encourage local production and supply chains is another one, as I already said. Tariffs can also incentivize automakers to establish manufacturing facilities and develop supply chains within the EU or the UK to avoid paying tariffs on imported components. This can lead to job creation and economic growth in these regions. And of course, it's a negotiating leverage. Tariffs can be used as a bargaining chip in trade negotiations. By imposing tariffs, a country can put pressure on its trading partners to make concessions in other areas. In the case of the EU and the UK, tariffs on electric vehicles could be used to negotiate better terms on other trade issues in the future. However, there are also potential drawbacks to imposing tariffs on electric vehicles. There's, of course, the increased costs for consumers. Tariffs can lead to higher prices for consumers, making electric vehicles less affordable. This could hinder the adoption of EVs, which is a key goal for both the EU and the UK in their efforts to reduce carbon emissions. And the disruption to supply chains is there, because tariffs can disrupt existing supply chains, making it more difficult and expensive for automakers to source components. And this could lead to production delays and higher costs, ultimately affecting consumers. And of course, there will be retaliatory measures. Imposing tariffs could lead to retaliatory measures from trading partners, resulting in a trade war that could harm both economies. The decision to impose tariffs on electric vehicles is quite a complex one, involving a balance of economic, environmental, and of course, political considerations. While tariffs can offer some benefits, such as protecting domestic industries and encouraging local production, they indeed carry potential risks, such as increased costs for consumers and the disruption to supply chains I explained. The industry in the EU and the UK is not fully prepared for the introduction of those tariffs on electric vehicles between the two regions, and there are several factors playing with it. First, there's the supply chain reliance. The EV industry in both the EU and the UK is heavily reliant on imported components, particularly batteries, from countries like China. The rules of origin under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement require the significant proportion of the EV's value to originate from within the EU or the UK to avoid those tariffs. And this poses a challenge for automakers as they struggle to source enough locally produced components to meet these requirements. And there's the limited local production. The EU and the UK are still developing their domestic EV manufacturing capabilities, and the production capacity for batteries and other key components is indeed limited. This makes it difficult for automakers to quickly shift production and meet the rules of origin requirements. And then there's the transition time, but you can argue that one. The original transition period for tariff-free trade in EVs was relatively short, as the industry says, giving automakers limited time to adapt their supply chains and production processes. The postponement of tariffs would provide some relief here, but the industry still faces the challenges in meeting the rules of origin requirements. And there are cost implications. The introduction of tariffs could lead to higher costs for automakers, as they may need to source more expensive locally produced components or pay tariffs on imported parts. And this could ultimately lead to higher prices for consumers, potentially hindering EV adoption. And of course, there's always uncertainty involved. The uncertainty surrounding the implementation of tariffs and the potential further delays creates challenge for automakers in planning their production and supply chains. And this is why it's fully understandable that the EU doesn't want to delay that anymore, to create certainty. The industry is still working to address these challenges by investing in local battery production or developing new supply chains and collaborating with governments to find solutions. But they are taking a long time already, and the industry is still not fully prepared for the introduction of tariffs on EVs between the EU and the UK. So it's finally time that they do their homework. And if you want to know something else, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.